And we are officially recording. So before we jump in and dive into the content of the session, we've got a few Zoom tips to share with you. You are invited to change your Zoom name to reflect your name, your institution, perhaps your pronouns as well. You can do that by hovering over your name in the participants list and clicking change name. We welcome everybody at this point to mute yourselves. We will be moderating a bit of conversation in the chat, so feel free to leave questions there that may make their way into the conversation that's happening. And please use the chat to connect with one another. We've been seeing in the Spring Immigration Workshop sessions that the chat has been really lively, and we really love to see that. Please do ask questions. This is a conversation. We would love to have your input and your involvement in the flow of the conversations. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ken to get us started.
Great. Hannah, thanks so much. I appreciate it. It's nice. My neighbor down the street in Amherst there. Thank you. I'll wave to you virtually. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to have all of you here. Thanks for being here today. With the exception of myself, we've got really quite an all-star cast of characters here that I'm very glad to introduce once again. First of all, Jigisha Patel, the Associate General Counsel and Chief Advisor for International and Immigration Services at Northeastern. Leslie Salefia, Senior Associate Counsel at UConn. And my friend and colleague, Sandra Torres, who is Associate Counsel for Immigration. And Sandra is with the entire university system, the five university campuses of the UMass system. So delighted to be here with this terrific panel. I'd also like to acknowledge Anthony Paluski as well. Anthony was really the brainchild of this session as well. So he is out there, and he's been a great contributor to initiating this session. We could probably do a case study on Anthony, actually, because what is work? Anthony is ensconced in California for the last several months. So this might be something that's particularly relevant and probably part of the reason why this was a brainchild of his too. So if you could go on to the next slide there, Hannah, thanks. I will say too that this session, I'm probably stating the obvious, but we want to just to reiterate that this session does not constitute legal advice, even though we've got legal counsel here. And quite honestly, you know, we're interested in a lot of your perspectives too, because I would argue that there aren't a lot of answers out there. We've all been making this stuff up on the fly as we go along, and it's really a lot about mitigating risk and analyzing risk analysis of our campuses. And so we really, you know, when the world shut down about a year ago, for so many different reasons, obviously, there was just an incredible amount of chaos in the logistical sense of things. But then when you start thinking about employment and payroll and personnel and taxation, all of these other sort of unintended consequences, it's really become quite a proverbial skin on an onion. So we wanted to separate things sort of two ways. Traditionally, obviously, employee sort of assumes staff, faculty, you know, researchers, but we also wanted to sort of kick things off today, first of all, focusing on students, because like many of you on our campuses, we have a tremendous amount of student employees, certainly graduate assistants here at UMass and many of the other larger schools. We have several hundred employees, and even though they're full-time students, they certainly constitute employees for a lot of payroll purposes and so forth. So we're going to take the first little portion of this session and discuss some specific student issues. And then the bulk of the session will be probably for the more traditional, what we would just lump in a big bucket of employees. As far as staff and faculty and so forth. So the first thing that I think we'll start touching on is, you know, as things started shutting down on the student side of things, the big question certainly for students, particularly students with scholarship and assistantships, is, you know, can I accept funding? Can I continue on payroll if I'm a new student versus an existing student? I think that was really the determining factor in many aspects. So I'd like to open it up to our panel to get some preliminary discussions on the specific nature of students either being brand new, not having yet arrived in the United States yet, versus students that were already here last March and then either remain locally or scattered to the four winds, but do maintain a SIWS record and student employment status. So first of the panels, would you like to touch on some of the institutional memos and policies that went out related to this?
Who wants to go first? So for all employment, not just students, but anywhere, normally the labor tax and employment laws of the local jurisdiction are going to control where the whenever someone where someone sits physically, those local laws will control. And therefore, whenever we had employment scatter through the wind, we had problems of how to identify what laws are going to control each individual, and then can we comply with them? UConn as a state institution are only really set up payroll-wise to comply with the laws of the state of Connecticut. We didn't even have systems to account for looking at various jurisdictions. It gets further complicated for new employees because many of them would not even have a social security number, right? So how do we put them into a payroll system when they lack a social security number? They lack a local bank account. We do not have a way to do direct deposit. And so there was a discussion on our campus about treating continuing different than treating new for those reasons. Others?
I'll add on to what you just shared, Leslie, and share that, the other piece is really how we're structured, our processes, our systems, right? Usually when we think about student employees, for example, they're tied to the campus. They're working and they're doing something, either on campus or close to campus. So for us, when we think about student employees, this was really a big change.
Webinar.
Because we didn't really, when you think about the process for collecting where they're going to be doing the work going forward, right? Or during this temporary period of time. So I think, you touched on the right things, that there's, the kind of varied compliance and different laws, and whether it's local or where you're situated as an institution that you want to comply with, all the things that you have to keep in mind, commuting versus not commuting. But for us, I think as an institution, we really wanted to continue engagements with students as much as possible. And that was kind of the driving force, where, what can we continue? And in some situations, are they scholarships, fellowships? What is the work component? And really looking at that very carefully and trying to determine, what's true services, what's, more for educational purposes versus work employment purposes. It took a lot of analysis to kind of drill down into those things. And then obviously, especially for new students, I think the biggest concern was, how to make a payment. As you said, if they didn't have a US bank account, didn't have a social security number and those things. But for the most part, we tried to continue where we could, existing opportunities or opportunities that students would have had if they enrolled, in a normal academic year with our institution.
And Sandra, do you want to mention something that's not unusual or unique to UMass, but something that UMass had instituted as far as the policy for graduate students in particular, with tuition waiver and assistantships, and for those new students, students that had not yet weren't able to arrive in the United States, how we mitigated that?
So, I think for the audience here, I'm going to say, it does make a difference whether your speaker is from a state, a public institution like Leslie and myself, or a private institution such as Jigisha. So already I'm seeing some differences. The University of Massachusetts followed a very similar approach as UConn did, insofar as we did make a distinction between first of all, in terms of our student employment, this was only applicable to graduate students. And in the graduate student space, it was only applicable to qualified graduate students. And that for us meant that, there was a recognition of the disruptive nature of COVID. and that many individuals were temporarily stranded, were unable to return to campus last fall. I'm going to go back to our fall guidance, which was, in a sense, extended for the spring of 21. But we did go through a series of requirements for who would qualify as our graduate students in terms of being allowed to remain on payroll, so to speak. So those individuals had to be appointed to an assistantship. They had to be continuing students. The assistantship had to be directly related to their degree program. All of these things which solidified that nexus between the employment was really needed for their program, for their studies, so that it wasn't the other way around, right? We were definitely there to support employment related specifically to graduate studies. Ken, I actually think you might have a little more detail to say in terms of how we did try, especially on your campus, because as Ken alluded to at the very beginning, I support all 5 campuses, and we have a very sort of decentralized organizational structure, meaning each campus and their chancellor gets to determine a lot of the operations. But what I did see was UMass Amherst making a big effort to sort of provide outreach and assistance to our newly admitted graduate students that did not qualify for employment if they were in a foreign country.
Yeah, I think we were very fortunate early on. Our provost, as you know, late spring turned into summer and midsummer, and the writing being on the wall that fall was going to be very disruptive, disrupted, I should say, and consular closings and so forth. So we did make the determination that any brand new student that was not able to get here for the first time that otherwise would have had a graduate assistantship, they were going to be given a tuition waiver. So obviously no compensation is possible given the stipend and assistantship funds could not be dispersed, but we were able to secure tuition waivers for them, which helps obviously because you know, there still is a very substantial tuition cost if they're not able to otherwise take advantage of the tuition waiver as graduate assistants. So that policy was instituted by the other campuses, I believe as well in the UMass system. So that was certainly helpful. I think that also tended to mitigate some of the anxiety that students were feeling. I think it also came across as a good gesture, frankly, and a sincere one that we were doing our best in very complicated times without a playbook for any of this stuff. So, so that is an issue that I wanted to bring up. Now, probably related to this, and this, you know, this could be an entirely a session by itself, but related to this, tax and labor compliance for third countries, right? So we have people that are doing assistantships perhaps or doing other types of employment as students, and certainly we'll talk about this as for employees in a bit as well. But would either of you like to sort of touch on the urban myth that we all know sort of potentially could be out there as far as the you know, existential risks of being out of compliance with third country tax and labor issues and law?
Absolutely. So when the COVID and remote work hit in around March of last year, there was a rumor going around. I don't know if it was ever verified, but I also don't know if there's been any enforcement to prove that it was not a legitimate rumor or understanding, that the European Union would forgive up to 6 months of remote work, understanding that everyone all across the globe were stuck in the location that they were whenever shutdown occurred, and were in theory creating domiciles in remote working situations that the employer never intended to create. So UConn, for example, we thought, okay, 6 months, this is going to be great. This will be able to get us through the summer and everything will open up into the fall. And then the fall came and things didn't open up, but we were starting to get a little inventive to say, could we not count the summer months if folks weren't actually working? And if we just count April and then start again in September for the work, are we under 6 months? And then whenever still our campus didn't fully open come spring 2021, we are well beyond the 6 month understanding. But it is somewhat, and every jurisdiction is going to have a different opinion about how much presence is needed to actually establish a presence and a domicile in that locale. But in general, it's basically 6 months with variations, but 6 months is the rule of thumb.
Jigisha, when we were on one of the strategy sessions talking about this session, you had mentioned some of the reciprocity, potential reciprocity with India in particular. Did you want to maybe touch on that? I know that that is something that has since hopefully died down a bit, but regarding taxation.
Yeah, so I'll just, here mention, we know that there's a lot of, most countries are wanting to support. They understand the pandemic has, had people are stranded in places that they didn't intend to be, and therefore they're providing services from those locations or services to those locations. And India is one where it's, we're in a still wait and see mode, because they were the only country, to my knowledge, at least anyway, that comes to mind, that brought about the tax levy for distance education, right? So if you were providing services and those services were being received in India, that there was going to be a digital tax, so to speak. There still hasn't been a lot of clarification, and I think mostly there was a lot of pushback from other countries, because you can see how quickly others will start to tax, to kind of be in a harmful position, and whatever gains might be gained by one country, are quickly taken away. So I think there's, we're still in a wait and see position of what happens there, but and a lot of people are kind of carefully watching that, because that could impact an institution financially, based on the number of students that they may have. There are in India waiting for arrive on campus. Myth out there is that 6-month mark. Some countries, in the past, traditionally, anything beyond 90 days can also be a big trigger. And so, here, what we did at Northeastern is whenever we had situations, that required, it seems like, would be require a further review between HR, tax, general counsel, we would review these situations and kind of look at our tax treaties, whether any exemptions existed, any kind of general outlines that might help. In some cases, we, try to accommodate requests for being remote because of the pandemic, but really focus on the fact that they were temporary, short term. And as Leslie said, that got harder to do as we went into the spring. But I think in general, the rationale that, but for the pandemic, and these are really intended to be U.S. services that are provided, is what everybody is trying to emphasize. And I think we'll have to wait and see what countries like India end up doing as the pandemic continues.
Before we go on to the section of the session about employees, staff, and faculty, and so forth, two other things I wanted to just bring up for the sake of the conversation today. In our brave new world of remote education and Zoom and everything else, people all over the world, very significant and critically important reminders regarding OFAC licensing and compliance, especially for countries that are sort of on the list, if you will. And we know the frequent flyers there: Iran, Syria, Cuba, North Korea, and what's always a bit more Byzantine is the Crimean region of the Ukraine, which is often not easy to define as far as citizenship is concerned, at least. But it's very important, and that's something we found institutionally, that as faculty shifted into remote Zoom world, the assumption was, well, that student from Tehran, they can't get here in the fall. Well, we'll just make sure they're plugged into our Zoom courses, right? And so, at least on our campus, there was a tremendous amount of outreach that went out to graduate program directors, deans, directors, saying, thou shalt not provide instruction for these specific countries. That's a tricky conversation, because you don't want to necessarily, how you frame that and frankly target those countries can be quite offensive. We have very active and vocal communities representing pretty much all of those countries, with the exception of North Korea, I guess, on our campus. And so to come out and sort of label all Syrians or Iranians as not worthy of Zoom education, that's a very tricky thing to do. You want to be very careful how that is rolled out on a campus setting. It doesn't take much for faculty to sort of take up a cause of the day as well on these sorts of things, as we all know. So, so I wanted to point that out, that the OFAC's compliance is incredibly important, and you really, need to be working with your export control folks on your campuses and academic affairs to, make sure what have you done to firewall those sorts of services and educational opportunities for people that might otherwise not be able to legally accept them on a remote basis. And the other thing too, if any of you have any quick comments on just the very nature of CPT and OPT for those students that were eligible, that were returning or continuing students on campus. Of course, the whole issue of work, not only are people scattered, but for our students that are wanting to do and needing to do internships, practicums, and things like that. How does that work in a remote setting? Do you need CPT? Do you need OPT? So anybody have a couple of quick thoughts on that before we move into the other segment?
So Ken, if I could just go back to your first piece when you were talking about export control and OFAC sanctions, because I think it ended up being sort of a real foundational piece as we, as an institution, were making these distinctions between how do we manage our international student, our graduate student employees, and how do we handle our non-student employees, everyone else, which is our next slide. And so much of the distinctions actually came from what was coming from Department of Treasury, Department of Commerce on export control and comprehensive OFAC sanctions. So I am by no means an expert here, but I do listen to my colleague who is. And last September, there was OFAC guidance that was issued that basically created what's known as a general license for these comprehensively sanctioned countries for students in certain degree programs, right? So that meant that there was now a license provided. You didn't have to apply for one in order for your students to have to be involved in online coursework, right? And the question right there is, is providing an online education to an individual either in a foreign country or a foreign national of these 5 comprehensively sanctioned countries, does that constitute an export or a service, right? That's the level of analysis that had traditionally gone on. What happened in September of 2020 is that they provided this general license that basically applied to graduate courses in the humanities and business and in law, and then to certain introductory STEM classes if they were ordinarily required to graduate in those liberal arts / law / business classes. Individuals could complete those studies online if they were from a comprehensively sanctioned country, right? A foreign national. Now, and that also applied to graduate assistantships. So that's what really opened the door for us to start really making a concerted exception when it came to our graduate students, is that OFAC sanctions were also covering assistantships that were required as an educational component of the degree program. So back to what I was saying earlier in terms of how we decided to classify an eligible graduate student for the purposes of continuing on payroll last fall, and then we re-upped it this spring. What happened was that Department of Treasury followed suit. BIS issued some similar guidance regarding export control. And then my understanding from my colleagues in the Treasurer's office is that the IRS also makes a big distinction between students and non-student employees. So during this period of COVID, there were several federal government agencies making these clear, bright line distinctions between student employment and non-student employment. So in addition to creating a lot of additional work for institutions in terms of complying with this new September guidance, right? It also allowed us to understand how the federal government was coming at this, because frankly speaking, the Department of Education was not issuing a lot of very clear guidance. So we were doing our best to cobble together what we thought was a reasonable approach to a pandemic from the agencies that were issuing guidance.
And also that the general license that OFAC issued, I'm sorry, Department of Treasury issued, it only applies if the student had their visa stamp already, their F1 visa stamp. So it was very, very narrow. One of the conversations we had on our campus is, well, how do we even know where a student is logging in from? But it does not matter physically where the student is at, it matters their nationality. So if the student is Iranian, this license would apply. But even if they were located in any other country in the world, but not the US, if they are prohibited from coming into the US.
Right. So our recommendation to our campus partners, because of that visa requirement, is that restrictive party screenings need to be conducted on any student who has yet to obtain a visa. Right? If you're going to have an enrollment action, you need to do a restrictive party screen if they have not received a visa. So that's been a new approach that's been happening. And it really means that many of the stakeholders on this call or on this Zoom, we're all here to kind of move individuals through that visa process and help support them through that visa process. And now there's all of these additional things happening when the visa hasn't been issued, right? So a lot of times your campus partners may think that, your international office owns this, but there really is a lot of work to be done to make sure that we are putting our arms around our entire student population, regardless of whether they have a visa, regardless of whether they're physically present in the United States or not. So that's a bigger lift.
Those were the emails that certainly came to us, no matter who owns it. It's certainly, I know, came into all of our inboxes for sure. Hannah, I think we want to keep moving along here and get to a big chunk of the segment here on, again, what would traditionally be more kind of employees in the sense of staff, faculty, postdocs, et cetera. So I just wanted, yeah, oh, sorry.
If okay, I'm just going to quickly touch on practical training. I'll just take a minute.
Yeah, thank you.
Just because I know at least at Northeastern, this is a hot topic and we're getting a lot of questions from employer partners, from students. And what we have heard from SEVP and what we're following is through the summer, we know there is continuing flexibility for remote. We're going to have to wait and see what happens about fall in terms of remote practical training, whether it's during CPT or OPT. But at least during COVID and from fall, spring, and through the summer of 21, we're going to continue allowing for that flexibility. And just another note that right now we do have that under 20 hours, restriction kind of lifted in the sense that students can or graduates can participate in OPT. And it can be less than 20 hours and they can maintain status. So all of those flexibilities continue through summer of 21 until we hear otherwise, but we hope that if needed that they'll continue in the fall as well. So that's something that we'll have to wait and see on.
Very good. Yeah, thank you for adding that. So moving on to international employees, obviously, again, this could be a whole separate session on just the I-9 policies, right? Leslie's put in at the end of the session, we've got a resource slide there, a very, very good step through of UConn specific I-9 policies. So you'll want to take a look at that. But related to I-9, sort of the next point in this slide here is, we all started receiving these questions. Well, we've got this new faculty member. They're not going to be able to be here on time, but we want to make sure they can start teaching because it's all on Zoom anyway, right? So, let's just do an independent contractor agreement, or maybe we'll just pay them once they get here, or God knows all of the types of things that kept flying at us, specific to, I think, especially faculty positions. So let's take a few minutes to talk about, kind of the do's and don'ts as far as What can you do up to a certain point, particularly when it comes to putting somebody on payroll that is literally not in the country yet, does not have a visa status, presumably H-1B or O-1 or maybe even J-1, as the case may be. So, so take a few minutes, and if we could talk about this. I know that all of us, many of us certainly, were getting bombarded with these sorts of questions in spring and summer.
I don't know if any of us have an easy answer to that.
Mm.
Easy caveats of this to carve out is that you do not have to worry about a visa status if someone is not physically in the US. So at least you don't have to worry about getting your H-1B approved in time or that visa stamp issued in time when the consulates are shut down. But then the question of bringing someone on whenever they are not in the US and don't have a social security number, and knowing that we might not be meeting the employment obligations of that locale where the employee is located, or the intended employee is located, those are really, really tough. And each institution is going to have to do their own risk assessment about what makes sense. The independent contractor option is challenging because just like each location has their own rules, each location is going to have their own independent contractor test. And I am certainly not well versed about what that looks like anywhere other than the United States or even the state of Connecticut. So I can't tell you what, for example, Peru might view as an independent contractor versus a standard employee. I can say that under the US law, it's very, very challenging, if not impossible, to label a teaching position as an independent contractor. Very, very tough. Research positions that are grant funded and a little bit more flexibility, then maybe the arguments can be made depending upon the oversight, because oftentimes PIs don't have a lot of oversight, right? They are leading their own independent investigations. But teaching is really tough to label as an independent contractor. One option that is out there for institutions are they're called POEs, or payroll providers, that work globally to serve as a dual employer that can meet the payroll obligations of that domestic location. Those tend to be, there is a price tag attached to it, right? So each institution is going to have to make their own decision about whether that option, which is the best option in terms of pure compliance, but if that is an option that is open to them, considering the price involved in the risk associated with each individual jurisdiction.
And just to interject there too, getting back to the previous point that we were talking about, again, you've got the foreign tax liabilities and potential labor issues in the third country as well, regardless of whatever sort of arrangement you may or may not have made with that new employee. So just stating the obvious, but obviously that's on top of everything else too. That's still something that exists out there. Sandra, did you have a... Well, I know you've got a comment on that.
So, along these lines, the president's office was not comfortable issuing any type of internal guidance to the campuses regarding a qualified employee working remotely outside of the United States. And it's because of all of the issues that Leslie just identified, right? We're talking about employment law, labor law, all of which are, for the most part, much more expansive in other jurisdictions than they are in the United States. I mean, when you talk about an employee for life, that's pretty much what you're contemplating here. If that foreign jurisdiction decides that that employment falls under their local laws, then your institution is going to be on the hook for a whole host of benefits to that employee that simply don't exist here in the United States. The tax considerations are also significant. In addition to, you still have to run all of your export control and restricted party screenings as well. So there's a lot of institutional sort of due diligence that needs to happen in order to make this successful if you want to manage all of those risk factors. The third-party vendors that are the best at mitigating everything, because basically they absorb those costs, they do that and they'll charge you up to a 30% sort of overhead fee in order to run payroll and make sure that all of the appropriate taxes, employer and employee taxes, are being paid. I don't know if they absorb export control and restrictive party screening. I think that would still have to happen within your respective institution. But I just sort of call all of this out because when a dean or a faculty member reaches out to a member of your office, they're not, generally speaking, they're not talking about any of this. They're talking about very transactional things. They're wanting to know how to process payroll, right? So sometimes, unfortunately, you're the one that has to sort of potentially bring other partners in, HR, whoever runs your, your taxation department, if that's the treasurer's office or not, to sort of have a much more robust conversation about this, because it isn't a mechanical payroll transaction. It isn't just about whether the person has a social security number and a US bank account. Institutionally, there are a whole host of considerations that need to be addressed.
I'll just add that I think COVID has really, the pandemic has opened the door, right? We always used to get requests about remote work opportunities or for someone to be in a location outside the US before. So I think, we may see more of these as people have gotten, comfortable with remotely either supervising or collaborating and not needing to have, presence in the US. So I definitely do think it, for any institution who has not explored a PEO, definitely worthwhile exploring. Doesn't mean that usually the cost is per engagement. It is definitely recommended because it provides those risk mitigations that you would otherwise look for. And it also provides a solution when you think about whether it's a senior official or a dean really looking to engage someone, that you have the ability to do that. Because as Leslie said, for teaching, there really is no way to do teaching services. And independent contractor assessments are getting stricter everywhere. So depending on the length of the engagement, I think that's also another factor.
Well, thank you, Jagisa. It's a perfect segue, really, because now we're looking at the other scenario for getting brand new people that have not yet arrived yet. How about Professor X as an H-1B that is, in California right now, or Florida, or wherever warm climate you might want to be, or wherever they may be, things, obviously related to the implications of an H-1B, the LCA, prevailing wage determinations, metropolitan salary surveys, all of those things now, as this definition of work, this is not going away, right? So once we're vaccinated and hopefully back to normal, we can only imagine the amount of requests and arrangements that are being made that, we may or may not be privy to. So, how to oversee and to try and get a jump on some of those things that what could be just a sort of a gentleman or gentlewoman's agreement on location, work location in the future, becomes a huge issue for location. If you're J1, do you do out of country, functions in CVIS if you're not, working and living in the United States? All of those sorts of things, unintended consequences here, really are something that keep me up at night, quite frankly.
Yeah, on the H-1B, the remote work, you have an obligation to pay the prevailing wage of the geographic location that the individual is sitting in. Yeah. Here at UConn, that did become an issue in a handful of cases when folks went outside of the state of Connecticut and did subject themselves to different prevailing wage determinations. And we had to adjust rates appropriately and file a new LCA and then H-1B to cover that remote work site. And you're right, even figuring out where folks at, they have to volunteer. A lot of times we don't have a way to track people. And so as long as there's no disruption in their payroll, their paychecks are still getting delivered to the same bank account that they were previously. We have no way to know that they have now relocated to Chicago. Yeah. And we need to look at what the rate is for Chicago. And even if the rate hasn't changed, most likely file an amendment to cover Chicago as a work site.
So that they can tack it onto the refrigerator door, right? So
yes.
They can post it up there. So Hannah, if you would please, the next slide. We want to keep moving along here. We want to make sure that we've got some time for Q&A as well. So I have, let me see here. For some reason, I'm seeing Leslie's face on my screen here rather than the, no, it's okay.
It's a technical difficulty on my end and I'm going to get it up again. I'm so sorry.
No, that's fine.
My PowerPoint just decided to crash.
Leslie, not that that was a bad thing to see your face on this. It was just that I was trying to read the slides there. So there we go. But certainly, you know, I mean, some other things to, as Hannah's working on that, you know, related to personnel in general and HR issues. So forgetting even the immigration piece of things, how is tenure review going to be looked at if somebody is not working locally or teaching physically in the classroom? Are there other personnel? Are there conduct issues? Are there all those other myriad of things that are, that live in the HR world? You know, are those things that could be impacted, perhaps negatively, you know, negative outcomes, people's, you know, criteria for review being a different scenario? Those things are, you know, also very, very important things to consider. And we're going to only have to wait and see how some of that works out. But could that on the back end be opening us up to, you know, litigation or complaints or grievances and things like that? Thanks, Hannah. We've got that now. Obviously, union concerns too. We've got, you know, many of our campuses are, you know, highly unionized. You know, if you're outside your benefit area of healthcare, right? So you relocate to another part of the U.S. and then you realize that, you know, your institutional medical insurance doesn't cover you in your new area of Chicago or wherever you may be. I mentioned earlier, you know, for those of us with a lot of J1 employees, particularly in the postdoc areas, if people are literally out of the US, how are you tracking the, you know, out of country functionality in SIWS? Do you have a plan in a standard operating procedure, I should say, that, you know, goes out to make sure we know where our J1s are and if we're in compliance with J1 regulations on site of activity? Related to that, how about J1s that need to maintain insurance, right? If they're maintaining the insurance based on the J regs, but they are back in their home country, which has fantastic insurance that is far better and at no cost compared to an outrageously expensive US policy, do you need to keep that updated? And do they need to keep paying into an insurance policy that they may or may not need? Other things too, you know, grant funding. Are there project restrictions for overseas work? Are you working on a Department of Defense contract that is, you know, we've talked about some of the export controls and other intellectual property issues, but, you know, are there just literally limitations on the grant itself that says you cannot do this from a third country or you have to be in the United States?
And could I put a thumb on that? I would work
Yeah.
for 10 years, but it was not until COVID hit. And I was very much well-versed in the whole export control realm, but I never appreciated until COVID that some of the federal grants likewise put restrictions on where you can physically perform the research, but
Absolutely.
It's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's actually increasing. So in addition to DoD, we now have NIH restrictions, NSF restrictions, and all of this has to do with a growing concern around foreign influence in academia. And so that's real, and it's probably not going to be going away with the change in the administration. I think it has significant bipartisan support. But yes, absolutely, there has to be a lot happening on the academic sort of the research side. If you are from a research institution, these are conversations that are also happening at your institution regarding tracking where individuals are if they're subject to grant limitations on overseas work.
And Senator, your point's so well taken, I think, about two things in particular. All of this isn't magically going to go away or be less enforced by a Biden administration necessarily. And the genie is out of the bottle. Again, in our brave new world of remote employment, you know, these requests are only going to keep coming. It's not going to go away once we all have shots in our arm, I'm sure. So,
and we also have a question on how far do we drill down? Just on Friday, I was having a conversation with our department head of Department of Chemistry, and we were talking about remote work for a GA for the entire upcoming academic year and about export control concerns and everything else that we're talking about, the grant restrictions. And he said, well, wouldn't this apply to any of my faculty who travel over the summer and are still committing effort to a grant? Or perhaps are on a 10th or 11th month appointment? And the answer is, well, yeah, it does. But we have never before ever thought about summer work for faculty who travel over the summer, right? So at what point do we start looking and it opening up this Pandora's box of everywhere else that it's happening that before was, you know, summer was summer. That was the best part of being a faculty member, right?
Yeah.
But now we might have to start tracking that.
Well,
Yeah.
and exactly as you say, and just that sense of entitlement. I don't mean it necessarily in a critical way, but the entitlement now, or the ability that you can do work remotely, right? And so why can't I, spend more time with my elderly parents, and I could still be a fully functioning staff member or faculty member or something too. So, it's not going away for sure. There's no question. I do want to get, as I mentioned, into some Q&A here. There's so much stuff here. This could be probably an all-day workshop. Not that you'd want to sit here and listen to me ramble on, but a couple other things, though, just to close the loop on this employee section. Data security, IT access. We spoke about OFAC earlier, but besides the obvious OFAC restrictions for faculty and staff, what is your own institutional risk as far as allowing people to have unfettered access through IT, either as continuing employees working in a third country, or as we're increasingly seeing in our office here, is people that are completely sight unseen. So we've got this Canadian person who's going to be teaching a remote class for us, but we need them to have full IT access, right? How about licensing restrictions in your libraries for digital content that can't be transferred across national lines and boundaries without very specific licensing agreements. And so this whole foreign IT and intellectual property access is just, again, sort of scattered to the four winds. So any other thoughts on specific to that sort of IT access, having the keys to the kingdom, if you will, as far as accessibility into our systems? Does anybody want to touch that with a proverbial 10-foot pole?
I think that increasingly, if your campus has any type of committee that deals with global or international issues, it's becoming increasingly important to have IT at the table, right? Because, COVID has certainly expanded sort of our reach, and where our systems are being accessed. But I agree with the comments that Leslie and Ken have already made. Like, the Pandora's box is open. And I think that there are a lot of discussions. I'm hearing about a lot of discussions happening in the HR space, both in the public and the private sector, regarding, a lot of places are not going back to what they were like pre-COVID, and they're already starting to prepare for that. And so because, before, when we talked about giving access to our systems, even if it was virtually, the individual was physically present in the United States. That may no longer be the case. And it's not necessarily, as Leslie pointed out, an international versus a domestic question. So I think that, having IT at the table is going to become increasingly important as we start to kind of understand all of the layers that are happening here.
Yeah,
just to add that privacy, and especially when you think about regulations of use of data and considerations there, there's so many countries that are enacting their own privacy laws, and it gets more and more complex when we think of what information is going to be pulled in, and what is it going to be used for as we all become more and more electronic. I think that's another area where, if you have committees or key stakeholders that you work with, making sure that you've got your privacy experts there too.
It's that's such a perfect point. If Hannah, if you wouldn't mind, just the next slide there. This rolls right into really what we wanted to make the point here, and we alluded to it earlier. But we cannot do this alone. We have got to be. I'm putting this broadly as international offices, who's the majority of our audience today, but all of us collectively on campus, we've got to work and communicate and have good working relationships with campus stakeholders, whether it be OGC, payroll and HR for obvious reasons. You've got to be working, of course, with senior leadership, academic affairs, export control. You cannot imagine a more critical time where those officers on campus need to be at the table in these very conversations that we're having as well. And so I think the tendency for all of us, sort of broadly speaking as NAFSANs, we wear our hearts on our sleeves. We want to help our international clientele, but we can't do it all. We can't do it all. We just simply can't. And even though we field a lot of these questions and requests, whether they be from far left field or wherever they may be from, we've got to make sure that we plug in and that we're working very much hand in glove with other campus constituencies. It's just absolutely critical. It really is. I'd like to allow us some time for some Q&A. I know that there's a lot of stuff here, probably more questions than answers even, but in the whatever almost 5-6 minutes that we've got remaining, could we, do we have any questions? Has everybody just sort of turned off their video screens and started happy hour early today with this topic, which wouldn't be a judgment, frankly. But we're happy to entertain any questions from the group here in the chat, or if you'd like to unmute yourself, we'd be glad to do that. Good. I think everybody has started happy hour early, so that's okay. So, you know, I think getting back to a couple of other of these things that we were talking about, heads are exploding all over Region 11. You're welcome. You know, again, I think that I just want to personally say that in particular, you know, working so closely with Sandra, how the relationship of having the General Counsel's office really just grounds us so much in our office on a almost literally day-to-day, hour by hour sometimes way, you know. And so, you know, if you don't have the working relationships or the you know, administrative structure, you know, please make sure that you're very well connected to your offices of General Counsel, because it's just such a tremendous resource for our campuses. And likewise for institutions that may not have the luxury of having maybe an in-house OGC, you really want to take advantage of a lot of the tremendous outside counsel that are in our area that, you know, are often contributors to our NAFSA world as well. I don't want to mention names. I shouldn't do that, but I think we all know some of the very, very excellent attorneys that we have in our region that we should all continue to take advantage of and to connect with as well. So, so any other questions here? I'm just looking at the.
Ken, I was just going to add that for people from international offices in particular, that sometimes, you know, you're very close to certain issues, and Sandra kind of mentioned this earlier, and we might not even think of something as being, you know, a topic that would be really worthwhile to explore further, or to, you know, kind of put some brain power around. So I just have to say, for our campus partners, you know, we really appreciate just even issues being raised or potential concerns, you know, for consideration, because that's how we learn about things. And we know that there's a lot happening, there's a lot going on, and sometimes some things you table. So I love it when people will flag what's a priority versus what's something that we'd like to table and address one day, you know, whenever that day may be in the future. But, you know, it really does help us. I think it helps, you know, our institution, our students, our community to just collaborate and work together on these things. It really, these ideas of what to tackle or what to work on kind of come from all parts of the organization. It really isn't top down or, you know, in any way. So I just want to say, you know, thank you to everyone. I know it's sometimes very, very busy and hectic, but always love collaboration.
Thank you. Yeah, for sure. Hannah or Ozan, I know that we have another session coming up with SIW specific to stakeholder engagement. Could one of you put that up on the chat? I know that that's coming up. Not to put you on the spot there, but that would be, you know, similar to our conversation today. I think emphasizing the need and the importance of working with your campus stakeholders.
But your international student office, you guys are the ones with the with the connection, the personal connection to the constituents that are actually traveling all over. So whenever they have a question, they're going to come to you for guidance. So as the first line of defense, it's so important that you have the connections with the rest of campus to facilitate these conversations and to bring them to the forefront.
Yeah, we're the fire station, right? I just tell people I'm a fireman. It's just much easier to explain what I do. Say, well, I work in an international office, and just tell people you're a fireman. It's easier.
Right.
So.
I do hope that by sort of talking about a lot of other agencies that we don't normally talk about, it really is a way of, it's a way of bringing other people to the table, or maybe the better way of putting it is when you have these conversations with other departments and stakeholders, maybe it'll incentivize them to start introducing or inviting you to the table when they have these broader type of compliance or risk management conversations about the university or your college, right? I think traditionally the international offices are sort of like the one-stop shop for all things international, but that really means visa related or immigration related. And international is starting to mean a whole host of other types of compliance areas. So by no means do I think that the international office needs to own so much of this. That's really not how this is going to work well. By engaging with your stakeholders, by sort of escalating these issues, it just shows that the international office is a very important partner and a much more comprehensive approach to how the university or your campus decides to look at these issues. So I do my best to actually try to keep my international offices focused on their very unique SEVP compliance area, but be very good at sort of escalating out other areas that do need to be addressed by other stakeholders.
Yeah, that's correct. And forgive me, the stakeholder session that we did have one a couple of weeks ago, that was Susan Ellison's session. I got that mixed up in my SIW schedule. So if you haven't seen that one, I think that underscores a lot of what we were saying today. Go back, and that's archived on video there. And Ozan, thank you. You just sent the link to that in the chat as well. So I think we're out of time. Again, this is a lot of stuff. I realize that we just kind of threw it out there to all of you, but hopefully it's two things really. Hopefully you know that you're not alone. We're all in this proverbially together. It takes a village. And also just to continue to work and to work with your campus stakeholders and partners, and information sharing. You really can never have too much of that. We do have some resources that are shown on the slides there now. I referenced the UConn I-9 site, which is excellent, and some other worthwhile resources as well. So I think we're out of time. I'd really like to thank the panel. It's been a pleasure working with all of you. Sincerely, I really appreciate it. Leslie, Jigisha, Sandra, likewise, Anthony, thank you for being the brainchild of this. And to our Zoom extraordinaire, Hannah, thank you very much again for running through the slides with us. So really appreciate it. So hope you all are taking good care. Be well, get your shots soon enough, and we look forward to seeing you again, hopefully very soon. So take care.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye, thank you.